Hi. All right. So, what I want to talk about this morning is self presentation and impression management. This kind of builds off of some of the theories we talked about in the last video, specifically Goffman's dramaturgical analysis as a kind of model for understanding the self from a sociological standpoint. So, I want to talk a little bit more about what he meant by impression management and some of the ways in which we use that language of theater to sort of conduct an analysis of the way in which interactions are structured. Remember, I wanted to point out again, because this is really important, he isn't saying that life is theater, in which we would be sort of looking at a completely insincere sort of model of human behavior. Rather, he's arguing that interaction is structured in much the same way as theater is structured. The audience, right, social others in this case, have expectations of us that are a function of the social positions that we occupy, the parts, in other words, that they assume that we play. We play these parts. In other words, we engage in role behaviors that they recognize as kind of legitimately attached to particular social identities. And they signal to us that they have accepted these social identities that we are presenting to them by reciprocating with social identities, complementary social identities of their own. Now, I'll talk in a few minutes about the way in which not all social interactions unfold the way that they're supposed to. But for the moment, at least, that's sort of your quick refresher on what Goffman talks about when he talks about using a dramaturgical analysis. All right, so impression management is essentially the act of presenting a particular image of ourselves to other people so that they form a desired judgment. We need to, and this again goes back to stuff we talked about in Chapter 2, we need to have a shared definition of the situation so that we can coordinate our social actions with those of others. So having some degree of agreement on the answer to the question, what's going on here, becomes the foundation for how we collaborate, how we align our behaviors and our actions with those of others to have social structure. This is kind of a foundational notion here. So we engage in these efforts to show other people the things about us that we would like them to see that would lead them to interpret the situation in a way that's favorable to whatever we're trying to get out of that particular outcome. All right, so dramaturgy, right? How do we use the language of theater to talk about this? Well, one really easy place where we can see this happening is in the idea of where social interactions occur. So Goffman, to describe the areas of social interaction where we're doing all of these performances and where we're working to maintain appropriate impressions, Goffman calls that front stage, right? Very much like being on a stage. Backstage, then, of course, would be any area of social interaction in which we are away from the view of an audience, right? So when we are home by ourselves in the absence of social others, either real or virtual, we would be able to sort of go over our previous performances. We could anticipate or rehearse future performances, right? So the backstage area allows social actors to engage in these kinds of rehearsals and evaluations. So front stage and backstage are really important concepts. Now, it's really important to remember that like everything in sociology, nothing is that cut and dry. Certainly, if you are in front of other people, you are front stage. You are giving information about yourself to these other people, whether you intend to or not, because they can see you. Remember, we talked about self-presentation as being both conscious and unconscious, the things that we share with people intentionally and unintentionally that lead them to form particular impressions of us. So when we are in the presence of other people, we are front stage. And again, just to make the point, I am recording this lecture in a room completely by myself, but I am front stage right now because I'm doing this with the idea that an audience at some point in the future, you, the viewer, will be watching this and forming an impression of me. So this would definitely be what Goffman would call front stage behavior, even though I'm completely alone, right? So I just said, if you're completely alone, you are backstage, but that means you can't be virtually engaged with the world. You can't be making an entry in a diary, or you can't be updating your Facebook status. You can't be recording something for people to watch later. That would very much be front stage. Okay, so you're front stage whenever you're in front of other people. You are backstage when you are completely alone, but there are times and places where this gets a little complicated. So imagine that you work in a restaurant as a server. A family comes in, they sit at a table in your area, you walk up to them with some menus, and you introduce yourself and you welcome them to the restaurant, and you go over the dinner specials and all of this. And right, you're front stage to this family that's seated at this table in your area. They are your audience and you are the performer, but they are also performers and you are their audience. Remember, it's always reciprocal. So you want to create an impression that you are, I guess if you're, any typical server, you want to create an impression that you are attentive. You want to create an impression that you're there to make their dining experience pleasant and as enjoyable as possible. Right? So you do and say things that sort of promote that definition of the situation, that interpretation of the circumstances they find themselves in. Then you go into the kitchen. And now you are backstage relative to that family sitting at the table in your area. You can say whatever you want about those people. They can no longer hear you. They can no longer see you, right? So now you're backstage to them. But you are simultaneously now front stage to your coworkers, or at least the ones who are in the kitchen. So you are backstage and front stage at the same time, and it's a function, of course, of which audience we're talking about. So you can say whatever you want about the people at table 5, because the people at table 5 are backstage to you. Then you go out onto the floor, and now your coworkers in the kitchen are backstage to you, and you are front stage once again with the people at table 5, in which case you can say things about the people in the kitchen without fear that they're going to see you and form an undesirable impression of you based on the things that you're saying. So you want to think about front stage and backstage conceptually, but you also want to think about it in practical terms, like what it looks like in actual social interactions, and realize that it's always a function of where you are relative to a particular audience. All right, so there's more, but again, this is an intro to these ideas. We're not going to go too far in depth, but again, if any of this stuff is interesting to you, there's a ton of stuff that Goffman created. His impact on the discipline is pretty significant when it comes to this dramaturgical analysis, and it's easy enough to find information on it out there in the broader sort of universe of sociological information. I want to talk a little bit now about what happens when our performances get disrupted, when things don't unfold as smoothly as we want them to. And to make this understandable, I've got to introduce a couple of concepts. The two concepts I want to introduce are what we call the actual self and the virtual self, or the virtual identity and the social identity, right? The thing that you are, which is your actual self, and the thing that you are expected to be, which is the social expectation specific to your status and role. A student, for example, is supposed to come to class prepared. They are supposed to turn in assignments on time. They're supposed to perform well on assessments like quizzes and exams and written assignments. So that would be the virtual identity. Not all students do that. And not all students do that all the time, right? So the actual performance and the expectation of the performance can sometimes not be lined up. When that happens, we have to engage in what's called an aligning action. We have to bring those two things back into alignment with one another. So an aligning action is essentially an action that you take to restore an identity that's been damaged somehow. And there are 3 kinds of aligning actions that I want to talk about in this video. I want to talk about accounts and disclaimers, and then finally I want to talk about cooling out. So we'll take them all in turn. Accounts are aligning actions. By the way, I want to say really, really quickly, these are all what we call vocabularies of motive. with the exception of cooling out. Cooling out will come a little bit later. But especially when we talk about accounts, we're talking about vocabularies of motive. These are narrative strategies. That term comes to us from C. Wright Mills, the guy who gave us sociological imagination. Aligning actions are narratives. They're stories that we tell that explain the discrepancy that exists between our virtual and actual identities. As such, they are conscious of, or they need to be conscious of, the audience to which they're being presented. Right, so this is, again, one of the things you'll see if you're paying attention is that even though Goffman's idea of self kind of takes us out of the space, the cognitive or mental space of an individual person and into the social environments in which they occur. Remember, Cooley, Mead, Kuhn, Zerker, those other guys, they're all talking about the self or aspects of the self that exist up here inside a person's mind. Goffman is talking about the self that gets presented and validated in social interaction with other people. His argument is that selves exist outside of individuals. They're products of interactions, not phenomena associated with individuals. So when we fail to live up to the expectations, we need to bring ourselves kind of back into consistency or consonance with those expectations. And to do that, of course, you need to know what the expectations are. You need to know the variations in the expectations that might exist within the audience, which means you have to be able to put yourself in the position of your audience to look at your presentation from their point of view. So right there, you see reflexivity and the I and the me sort of very actively part of the theory that Goffman has proposed. He's not negating Mead or Cooley. He's not saying those guys are wrong. He's not saying that the structural interactionists with their focus on the self-concept are wrong. He's not saying those things are unimportant. He's saying those things are less important than what we express. But this whole endeavor of self-presentation, this whole sort of dramaturgical notion of selfhood, only works if Mead and Cooley are correct, right? So it's there, but in Goffman's instance, he just sort of assumes it and sort of moves on and focuses on the actual implication and presentation of this stuff rather than the things that might actually be motivating it. So to the extent that this theory is kind of a significant departure from Mead and Cooley, that is absolutely true, but you should be able to see the way in which Goffman's theories really only work or hold up as kind of valid explanations for social behavior if these underlying assumptions are in fact accurate. Okay, so back to vocabularies of motive. So when we engage in what's called an account, we're going to offer up a story, right? A narrative, a vocabulary of motive to explain unanticipated, embarrassing, or unacceptable behavior after that behavior has occurred, right? So you show up at the end of the semester on the day that a written assignment is due. You do not have the written assignment on you. The expectation is that a good student has their homework with them, so now you've got to account for this discrepancy, and you offer up what's called an excuse, right? The dog ate my homework, my computer crashed, something, right? Something that will ultimately shift the responsibility for this discrepancy off of you and onto something that's ultimately beyond your control. So that's what we mean by a vocabulary of motive. It's a story that you tell that explains why you're doing the thing you're doing. In this case, why you're showing up without the homework that was expected of you. So accounts will always come after the discrepancy has occurred. There is another aligning action in which the narrative comes ahead of the potentially discrediting behavior. We call those disclaimers. So disclaimers are efforts to sort of forestall any complaints or any negative reactions to the behaviors or statements that we are about to engage in. We recognize ahead of time that the thing that we're about to do or the thing that we're about to say might in some way damage how we are seen by people. It might actually create a discrepancy in the virtual identity and the actual identity. So you offer up a disclaimer. Maybe you're giving a speech in a speech class and you get up in front of your classmates and the teacher. You know that you are supposed to speak with confidence and clarity. You're not supposed to lose your place. You're supposed to follow the flow of your ideas from the beginning through the body and into the conclusion. But you also know that that might not happen, that something could cause you to stumble or lose your place or make a mistake. And so you might say something like, I'm very nervous, or I'm not used to doing this, right? That is in essence an effort to sort of shut down any potential surprise or shock when that in fact actually happens to you. It is an absolute rule of thumb that if a statement begins with the words, I'm not a racist, you can be pretty sure that the phrase that's going to follow next is pretty racist. All right, because you want to make sure that the racist thing that you are about to say does not in some way come back to taint you as somebody who holds racist ideas. Right, so that's a disclaimer. And again, disclaimers come before, and like accounts, they require us to be sort of mindful of the expectations of other people, of us in these moments. So again, we still end up using our capacity for reflexive behavior and our skill with regard to role taking to manage that. When it comes to the virtual and actual identities, and specifically accounts and disclaimers, it's fair to say that what you're trying to do with an account is to change the actual identity so that it is realigned with the virtual identity, right? So you have the expectation, which we call the virtual identity, and then there's the thing that you've done, right? That's your actual identity. So your narrative is supposed to sort of bring that alignment about by recasting the actual identity in a way that it becomes understood differently by the people who are observing it. On the other hand, with the disclaimers, what you're ultimately trying to do is get people to change the expectation, right? To be more in line with your anticipated shortfall or discrepancy, right? So you're still aligning things, but in one instance, accounts, you're trying to align or realign the identities by changing the actual identity. In disclaimers, you're trying to realign a potential discrepancy by changing the expectations or the virtual identity. Now, the last of these three is cooling out, and cooling out is a little bit different. Cooling out actually comes from the language of scam artists and grifters, and the idea is the longer phrase is cooling out the mark, and the mark, of course, is the person who's been taken advantage of. So in these swindles, in these con games, the mark, often upon discovering that they've been taken advantage of, gets very angry. And they could do all kinds of things that potentially disrupt the scam, like go to the police or try to take matters into their own hands. So in that instance, somebody in the confidence game, somebody who is part of the scam, will need to find a way to get the mark to not do anything radical or dramatic. So Goffman takes this concept and he applies it to these kind of social interactions in which our identity has been damaged. In the case of cooling out, what we are trying to do is persuade someone who's become embarrassed or who has lost face to accept a less desirable alternative identity. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. You can't pretend that this person doesn't have a damaged social identity, but maybe you can persuade them to accept a social identity that's still okay, even if it's not the original social identity that they wanted to hold. If you're in a relationship and the relationship comes to an end and your significant other sort of breaks up with you, you will talk to your friends, and your friends will say all kinds of supportive and reassuring things like, you're going to do better. There are better people out there. This person was never somebody we really liked all that much. You're better off without them. They can't pretend like you didn't get dumped, right? They can't sort of say, no, that didn't happen to you. That discrepancy has already occurred. That ship has already sailed. But if they can reframe your understanding of the events that just transpired, then maybe you don't feel quite so bad about having gone through that experience. Your identity is less damaged. I got scammed once. I was in New Orleans, and this guy comes up to me. I'm walking home from the quarter with some of my friends. I was there for a conference. We'd been drinking. This guy comes up to me and he says, "I'll bet you," he picked me, so I must have, one of those faces. He said, "I'll bet you $20 I can tell you where you got your shoes." I'm, as I said, I've had a few drinks, not necessarily at my peak ability, and even when I am at my peak ability, I'm not sure it's all that great. But this guy says, "I can bet you $20 that I can tell you where you got your shoes." I'm like, "Okay, I'll take that bet." I put the $20 down on one of those little bollards, right? A little thing that protects the sidewalk from the street. Put my $20 down on top of it, and he goes, "You got them on your feet." And he grabs my $20 and he starts to walk away. And I'm really angry because I feel stupid, because that was pretty stupid. And I'm embarrassed because all my friends just saw me be made a fool of. So I kind of come up to the guy and I'm like a little belligerent, and I'm kind of yelling at him. Not a good sport, I guess. He turns around to me and he says, "Everybody falls for that." Now, that didn't necessarily make me feel better, but I can see it for what it was, right? He's not going to say, "You're really smart and you don't fall for stupid swindles," because I clearly just did. What he's saying is not that I'm not stupid, but that I'm no more stupid than anybody else, which is, I guess, okay relative to being sort of noteworthy and exceptionally stupid, right? If nobody fell for that except me, then I'd feel really bad. But if everybody falls for it, I just feel a little bad. That's called cooling out, right? You want to take the person whose identity has been damaged and you want to persuade them to accept an alternative to the damaged identity, to look past that to some other way of thinking about yourself, some other way of thinking about yourself, to sort of make the emphasis. Now, one of the things that I think it's important to note is the difference between cooling out on one hand and disclaimers and accounts on the other. And the big difference is that we offer up accounts and disclaimers. They come from us in an effort to either forestall some discrepancy or a reaction to a discrepancy in our actual and virtual identities, or to address a discrepancy that already occurs. In the event of cooling out, it requires sort of collaborators. It's a team effort. You can't cool yourself out. Other people have to do that for you. They have to be there to offer that up to you. And so in that sense, it's, again, an explicitly sort of social phenomenon, because it is our community. It is our social support network. It's our friends. It's our family. It's whomever we have to be talking about. It's these people stepping up and helping us to maintain a sense of self that is one that we can live with, that is one that is acceptable to us, because we can't really control the sort of discrepancies and events and occurrences that result in disrupted performances. But cooling out illustrates the reality that other people are somewhat invested in the stability of our identities, in addition to us, right? It's easy to see why we would be invested in those, but it's also the case that other people are invested in them as well. All right, last thing I want to talk about for this video is the notion of stigma. Now, stigma is also something that complicates self-presentation and impression management efforts, but unlike the disrupted performances that require sort of temporary fixes like aligning actions or disclaimers, stigma is much more persistent. Stigma is not a temporary disruption of one's identity. It's an ongoing sort of set of conditions that a person kind of has to deal with. So stigma is basically a deeply discrediting characteristic that other people see as an obstacle to competent or morally trustworthy behavior. Now, stigma are explicitly social, right? The thing that stigmatizes one person in a particular social environment might not stigmatize another person in a different social environment. If you think about, the way that the Me Too movement has kind of created, different reactions to accusations of sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. Harvey Weinstein goes to jail for his serial abuse of women. Donald Trump gets elected president, right? His stigma, that of his, abundant and self-admitted sexual misconduct, not only doesn't result in him being sort of marginalized or sort of looked down on, he actually finds that he gets rewarded for this. A significant portion of the American electorate get behind him in his campaign for president. And again, Harvey Weinstein, who did many of the same things, is now serving time in prison. Right, so same behavior, sexual misconduct toward women, does not equally stigmatize people. So stigma are pretty serious features of certain identities, but not all stigmatized people, or I should say, not all people who share a stigma are equally stigmatized by that stigma. But nevertheless, right, you can't simply sort of walk past stigma. It requires a lot more to sort of manage and deal with than the things that would lead to accounts or disclaimers or cooling out. Goffman noted that stigma come in three categories. There are what he calls defects of body, there are defects of character, and there are what he called stigmas of the tribe, which would be understood as membership in certain groups. So if you are, I've done a significant amount of research on homeless people. Homeless people, more often than not, are highly stigmatized by their identity as people who are unhoused. Very often, that is seen as a character defect. So the stigma has to do with the assumption on the part of other people that one ends up being unhoused because you're irresponsible, you're a drug or alcohol addict, you can't hold down a job, maybe you have associated mental illnesses that complicate your ability to remain in housing. So people who are homeless often have to work very, very hard to overcome the consequences of being in this stigmatized category, because it is also kind of an affiliated or shared stigma, right? The stigma of the tribe. And it has profound implications for one's social relationships. Give you just one of literally hundreds and hundreds of examples from the years of research I've done. I met a guy in the South Loop in Chicago years ago when I was collecting data, and he was a panhandler, right? So he would walk up to people and ask for money. The South Loop around, say, Wabash and Michigan Avenue is home to a number of different colleges and universities. So you've got the School of the Art Institute, you've got Robert Morris University, you've got Columbia College, right? So a lot of young people, a lot of college-age students sort of wandering around a quarter-mile radius area on the South Loop there. So this guy who was in his 30s at the time, I call him Jackson because that's where I found him. He was on Jackson Street sort of panhandling, and I struck up a conversation after observing him for a while. His approach, his self-presentation strategy is to walk up to mostly younger people and say, "I'm not going to lie to you. I'm homeless. It really sucks. I would really love to have some money so I could just go buy a drink, something to take the edge off." And most of these people who respond positively do so because they reason that at least he's being honest, right? They don't like the idea that he's homeless and that he's going to use this money for alcohol, but at the very least, he's not lying to them. So they tend to respond with a little bit of generosity. The interesting thing is that what he does with that money is he goes and he buys a bus pass, or he goes and he pays rent on a single room occupancy hotel, or he does laundry, or he buys groceries. He is a recovering alcoholic. He does not drink, but he finds that when he goes up to people and says, "I'm a recovering alcoholic, I don't drink, I need money for bus pass, I need money for rent on my hotel, or for groceries, or to do laundry," they don't believe him, because in their head they have this idea of what homeless people are like, and the things that he is saying don't square with their stereotype. So he lies to them and gets rewarded for honesty. When he tells them the truth, he's punished because they think he's a liar. So that's the power of a stigma. It can fundamentally shape what sorts of self-presentation strategies are likely to be received by an audience, and the selves then, as a result of that we're able to have, are a function of how we're kind of navigating our way around the stigma. So again, much deeper, much more consequential than something like a disrupted performance, like you forgot your homework. All right, so that takes us through self-presentation and impression management. Next time, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about some macro social processes. In this case, we're going to start out by talking about deviance. A lot to say about that, but I will bore you with that on another day. Take care.